Hello. Hi, good evening, afternoon actually still, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Mayara Foli. I am the co-founder and executive director of Plataforma CIPÓ, which is a think tank based in Brazil, which is dedicated to promoting international cooperation for climate action and sustainable development. Plataforma CIPÓ is also the co-lead of the T20 task force on climate actions and just and inclusive energy transitions. So we are part of the T20 family, and this event is a collaboration between CIPÓ and IPEA, which is the Institute for Applied Economic Research, which is one of the organizations of the T20 Brazil. And as you can imagine, this year has been a very busy year for all those involved with the G, the T, the C20, and all of the engagement groups. We had dozens of events. We curated, in our case, hundreds of policy briefs, especially in the organizing committee here represented by Fabio. So a lot of people said, but why organize another event? And when we were thinking about the idea of putting together this proposal to have this event today, we were thinking, unlike the previous events that we've been, this is quite unique because of the timing, right? Because for the first time, unlike the other gatherings we organize, we are able to already reflect on what have been the achievements of Brazil's presidency of the G20, what worked, what didn't work. And in our view, especially from a think tank, civil society perspective, I believe we need to look into the G20 and especially the Brazilian presidency in two different ways. The first, through a more like short-term approach. So what are the actions and what we've been calling the action agenda that Brazil has proposed and has been able to achieve within its first year of its presidency? And in that regard, I think we can already say, even though we're still waiting for the summit in November, I believe we can already say that Brazil has been successful for many reasons, right? Brazil has approved, obviously, with its G20 partners, high-level principles on bioeconomy, for instance, being the first time that this topic has been negotiated in an intergovernmental process. Brazil's presidency delivered the roadmap on the reform of the multilateral development banks. We have achieved the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, which Fabio will talk a little bit about today as well. The G20 Task Force on Climate Change. For the first time, we had the Sherpa, the finance track coming together around the climate agenda. We had just last September in New York the call to action on the reform of global governance. Again, for the first time, the G20 has brought the UN member states to think more systematically in terms of what are the reforms which are needed to reestablish trust in the multilateral system. We have also a major achievement in terms of bringing attention to the taxation agenda with the proposal for the and fair taxation of the super rich, and this list goes on and on. But I think we also need to look a little bit in the longer term and in terms of the more structural reforms that are needed to make the international financial architecture more credible, more effective, and just. And in this sense, I believe the Brazilian presidency did plant some seeds, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And in this sense, the South African presidency, we really need to invest and make sure that the momentum that has been generated in a lot of those topics are carried through, because we know South Africa will close this cycle of G20 presidencies being presided over by developing countries. So that's why we are here today, because when it comes to the topic of this afternoon's discussion, financing for climate action and for the reduction of social inequalities. I think there's almost no one better in Brazil to be talking about those issues than those people here sitting next to me, who in different capacities, different ministries and organizations have really put a lot of energy in ensuring a lot of the successes that I mentioned and some of the successes which I haven't yet mentioned, but they will address in their remarks. So we have here Fábio Veras, who's the Director of International Studies of the Institute of Applied Economic Research, IPEA, who is one of the 3 leading organizations of the T20 Organizing Committee. We also have right next to him Adriana Abdenou, who is the Special Advisor to the President of Brazil. Then right next to her is Luiz Andrade from Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we'll also be representing the G20 Task Force Clima. Right next to Luiz, we have Tatiana Berenger, who is from Brazil's Ministry of Finance, and she also coordinates the G20 social within the finance track. And finally, Marcos Vinicius Chiliato, who is the World Bank Group's Executive Director representing Brazil, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Haiti, Panama, Philippines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for being here with us today. We know that you have a very busy week, and we really appreciate the time that you dedicated for this discussion. So we are going to follow a roundtable format. I'll be posing some specific questions to each of the speakers who have 5 minutes to respond to them in the first round of questions. Then we go to a second round of questions, another 5 minutes. And if everyone sticks to time, we should also have some time at the end for Q&A. So I will start with our co-host of this event, Fábio, to talk a little bit about your T20 experience, right? For the first time, the T20 engagement group was able to come up with a communique in July at the Sherpas meeting in Rio de Janeiro with 10 concrete recommendations which were presented to the Sherpas in Rio. So if you could talk a little bit about this experience and especially its relations with the topic of today's discussion, climate action, reduction of social inequalities. Thank you, Fábio.
Thank you, Mayara. Good afternoon to everybody. So just to quick go through to the key or the priority recommendations of the T20, I think it's important to say that we had six task forces working on the different themes that are covered by the different working group initiatives and task force of the G20 on both, on the Sherpa track and the finance track. As you know, the G20 has increased a lot the thematic issues that it covers, and the think tanks have been trying to follow up and to keep pace with all these issues, which means that in the T20 Brazil, given the new issues that have been brought, we had to make a call and to invite more think tanks that are specialized in thematic issues, better aligned or closer to the 3 presidential priorities of Brazil's presidency. So that was the first challenge that we had. The second challenge that we had actually in writing up the communique is that we need to prioritize things and we need to bring together and sort of have a hierarchy in terms of what we are going to recommend. And it turned out that it was pretty clear that the think tanks were coming up with cross-cutting recommendations. So not only Task Force 2 that was primarily dedicated to energy transitions and climate action, we're actually talking about the means of implementation that we need and the G20 needs to reinforce in order to reach both the SDGs in 2030, but also the targets for the Paris Agreement. So I think that is the distinct characteristics of the Brazil presidency is that the three dimensions of sustainable development were really brought together in a very powerful ways. And the think tanks through the T20 were able to come out with these recommendations that speak to many of the working groups and the initiatives. Mayara already highlighted the 10 principles, the high principles for the bioeconomy, and that was something that was actually pretty much highlighted in the recommendations of Task Force 2 that we brought on board in our priority recommendations. So whenever we looked at the traditional discussions within the G20, for example, how to make the multilateral development banks bigger and better and more effective, we tried also to see the other areas that have been neglected. So, for example, the whole discussion around adaptation, the discussion around bringing also indigenous people, local populations in discussing the issues and the means of implementation on how to keep biodiversity, for example, was something that was highlighted. So it was not only about mitigation, about decarbonization, not to say that it's not important, it's very important, and the recommendations were clear on that, but also that we need to go further and to discuss those that are more likely to be left behind if we don't have think tanks looking at these issues and also the civil society. Did I miss anything?
No, and you respected the time, which is great. Thank you, Fabio. I'll move on now to Adriana. As I mentioned in my introduction, in New York, this call to action on the reform of global governance was released on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly this year. So if you could explain to us a little bit about this call to action, especially with regards to the reform of the international financial architecture.
Thank you very much, Mayara, for an invitation to be here and to be able to share the panel with such wonderful colleagues. I'm very lucky to be able to work with everybody here at the table and to have a civil society that has contributed so much to the presidency, the Brazilian presidency of the G20, the T20. I cannot say that I have read all 160 policy briefs, but I did read all of the recommendations. We discussed a lot of them within the President's Advisor's Office, and we really see the value of what President Lula says. You know, we need civil society to point out the mistakes, to correct the paths, and to generate new ideas. So it's a real partnership. The call to action that Brazil brought to New York recently was a consensual document from the G20 that offers a systemic view. It's a pretty bold document. And I wanted to go through very briefly the main components. The first one has to do with reform of the UN system, including but reaching beyond what was promised in the Pact for the Future, in recognition that we need to rescue multilateralism, and the UN system should be the center of that effort. However, it's a system that was created in the mid-1940s, designed to tackle the challenges of that era, and therefore needs upgrading. Needs upgrading not only in the sense of reform of the Security Council, which is a cause very dear and historical to Brazil and other countries, but also look at areas like the General Assembly, which is the most democratic space within the UN, the Peace Building Commission, to reimagine the function of the Economic and Social Council, which has lost steam but should be a very important space for discussion and initiative, and other parts of the UN system. The call to action also highlights some ideas within reform of the international financial architecture. And the overarching goal here really is to fulfill the 2030 agenda. It's an agenda that often gets forgotten. Sometimes I think it gets erased. And we need to bring it back because there's the backsliding, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, has been massive. And we see rising numbers of poor. We see that inequality has risen to really unacceptable levels. So we cannot lose sight of that. Fabio mentioned the reform of the MDBs, which we discussed within the G20, but also coming back to the old discussion of reform of IMF quotas, because unless we have truly representative and inclusive institutions that reflect especially the Global South, which has been lacking in representation, we won't have country-led development. We won't have country-led transitions. We won't have country-led justice. The call to action also mentions an area in which our friends from Ministry of Finance have made a huge effort, which is the issue of progressive taxation and international cooperation on taxation, including of the super rich, a topic we've been debating here in Washington. But it goes beyond it too, to call for greater fiscal space for developing countries. And I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about this, but I'm running out of time. That includes, of course, ensuring greater concessional finance, which is a real challenge in a context, a broader geopolitical context in which rivalries are taking place and countries are stagnating in their ODA commitments, and it's becoming harder to access funding, even though there is no dearth of finance around the world. And then there's a last component to the call for action, which I think we touched on in our presidency of the G20, but we really need to think deeper, and we're going to need civil society very much to help us do this, which is thinking about the international trade system. The WTO, as you know, is mostly paralyzed. A lot of countries are resorting to new waves of protectionism that are driven by the securitization of trade, often under the veneer of sustainability. And if we all adhere to this wave, it will be a race to the bottom. How can we reimagine a trade system that is fairer, that really focuses on development rather than casts that aside, as was done after the Doha round, that rescues multilateralism in an area that has lost it, and that brings in seriously the issue of technology. Developing countries shouldn't just access technology. They should also develop and innovate in technology. And rather than be beggars of technology, develop the capacities. And again, this goes back to the beginning. This all requires fiscal space. It requires inclusive global governance. So I'll stop here by saying that, by the way, in his speech at the General Assembly, President Lula repeated a demand that many actors in civil society have insisted on, which is we should reopen the Charter of the United Nations. It's a very bold call. It's one that's made by many voices, and it will require immense mobilization and work. But only if we are bold can we have a system that's truly efficacious, but also just. So thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, and also for reminding us about this very bold call in terms of the UN Charter. We as CIPÓ have been working with other think tanks in different countries on this idea, and we also invite new contributions because we will need some fresh insights on what are the key pillars that need revisions, what are the clauses we need to protect. So thank you for addressing that, and also for touching upon some topics which I believe Luis will address in his remark. We often hear a lot about the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, but another strong innovation of Brazil's G20 presidency was what we call Task Force Clima, so Task Force on a Global Mobilization Against Climate Change. And for the first time, in 2 days, I believe, there will be a joint meeting of finance ministers, of ministers of foreign affairs, and governors of the central bank to discuss the outcomes of this task force. So, Luis, if you could talk a little bit about what are the expectations for this ministerial meeting happening here in DC, but also for those who aren't familiar, the task force has 2 main thematic priorities. And we're hoping that in your initial remarks you could also address the priority 1 related to advancing credible, robust, and just national transition plans.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to talk to everyone that come to see us here, and also people who are watching online. Let me just very briefly explain a bit the idea behind TF Clima. So we created this task force, so it's a time-bound initiative. It starts with our presidency, it finishes with our presidency, and it gathers for the first time the Sherpa and the finance tracks around the climate change agenda. So we have to recognize that the G20 has not started from zero with our presidency on climate change. So there has been work, there has been extensive work, which got more traction after the adoption of the Paris Agreement. But those two tracks were working perhaps in silos. And we then took the decision to gather, in our case, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, the Ministry of Finance, and the central banks, to put them together in a room, and we gave them a task. And the task is, we have to develop an enhanced agenda for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and one that keeps the 1.5 goal alive, which is very much in the interest and in the heart of President Lula. And that was the mandate that was given to us, and that was the mandate that we gave to G20 representatives, and also 15 invited countries and around 25 international organizations. So a bold task in 8 months, and we are now nearing the ministerial meeting that Mayara referred to. So in 2 days we'll have, for the first time, ministers of foreign affairs, finance, and climate and environment, and central bank governors delivering a joint message on what needs to be done to enhance the implementation of the Paris Agreement and to keep 1.5 alive. We organized the technical work that led to this ministerial meeting around two main ideas, which we called resetting action and resetting finance. And the idea of resetting is very important, because what we really need, and that goes to the reform of international organization, that goes to the need to mobilize more finance and more action. What we really need is a reset, a rethinking of how the structures are established and how they are working in order to deliver what we need to deliver, which is still very hard. We are working towards the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We have succeeded in a way, because we got away from a scenario that was leading us to an increase of 4 degrees if nothing had been done, if the Paris Agreement had not been adopted, to a scenario where we are, if all NDCs are fully implemented, we would be still around 2.1 degrees. And the science evolved very much after the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And the science is very clear now that there is a huge difference between a 2-degree scenario and a 1.5 scenario. And that call came out very strongly from COP28 as well. So we had a good basis, given how science evolved, how the COP28 responded to that, what we are calling a course correction, and reiterating this resolve to pursue 1.5. And then we had this basis, and we gave that task to G20 members and the invited countries and guests. And we have had a very positive response. We organized the discussions on resetting action around the idea of going beyond NDCs in terms of the NDC. Presenting an NDC, the obligation of the Paris Agreement is basically to deliver a communication piece to the convention and to the international community that this is what we are going to achieve. But we thought that we have to delve a bit deeper on how we can do that. And what we did was promote a discussion on transition planning. So what are the good tools that are available, or that are part of the experience of G20 and other countries for delivering what we are calling national transition planning, and the idea of country platforms that was something that we started discussing in 2020 that evolved a little bit more in 2022 with the COP27 in Glasgow, and that we're very proud now that we, in 2 days, we will be announcing a set of voluntary principles. As you know, the G20 works on a voluntary basis. It's not legally binding, but that will be delivering something that will be welcomed by ministers, that will guide and inform the future development of country platforms, that will help gather more action for mitigation, for adaptation, and really turning NDCs into investment plans that can mobilize both public and private action. So it is a very promising outcome. I can talk more in the, I've already had my 5 minutes, so in the next round I'll try to talk about the second priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, for explaining to us a little bit, and wish you a bit good luck for Thursday. I will now pass to Tatiana. We know you just came back from South Africa, where you were discussing already the handover from Brazil to South Africa. But before we do that, at the end of the year, if you could reflect a little bit, what, from the perspective of the finance tract, you consider to be the key achievements of Brazil's presidency, and if you could talk a little bit more also on a topic that Adriana has already touched, which is the agenda on taxation and fiscal justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayara. So, first of all, I would like to congratulate T20 for the role that you played during our president. It was really, really important. So thank you, Plataforma CIPÓ. Thank you, IPEA. It was really important for the presidents of Brazil to have you working with us. I think as T20, I think it's good that people know you made something that is to give it more open to more stakeholders. It was a difference in the Brazilian president's T20, and it is a big, big pleasure to share with these distinguished and lovely colleagues this session, this panel. So I will summarize here the same as I did in South Africa about the challenges and the achievements. I think we cannot just say as a laudatory, like, oh, how we are amazing and we did a lot. First of all, these teams were not easy to achieve. It's a difficult space, the finance track. So to innovate on that is very hard. It was something that we talked to South Africa colleagues, the importance to have priority to establish what do you want to have in the end of the presidents, because you need to focus in some kind of priorities or activities to have really a good result. I think in terms of how we made some new approach to the global economy, it was the cross-country of inequality, the first priority of Brazilian presidents, and how it was inserted in all the working groups. So the idea of taxation came from how to combat inequality in the current phase of world political economy. That was the mean. And it was linked, not with, you cannot just thinking about taxation. It's not just a fiscal, but we need a fiscal space. So what kind of state, what kind of political economy? So the idea is to present a new approach for a global economy. We need to have state combating economy. So for that, the state needs to play the role of public policy. That was very hard when we were talking with central banks, presidents, and Minister of Finance. That was, so I think, achievement, but at the same time a challenge. And the second point was how to increase the resources for sustainable development. And so I think we work in these two ways to present something different. So in the area of to combat inequalities, the international taxation agenda was something new. It was not one working group at the finance track, so we made 2 sessions at the ministerial level to debate this theme. So we also invite a professor, so someone from civil society, to present a report, to talk with the ministers, and then we had the ministerial declaration. So step by step, and thinking how we could really address something concrete. One of the things is that we need to have concrete results when we are talking about G20. That was one of the things when we are discussing 25 years of G20. What's going on? No. So it's important, I think. And then we also present or develop, make some progress on the roadmap for MDBs and the SDRs channeling, the idea of the use of SDRs in other situations than not just to be a reserve for the states. That's one. And it can be canalized to the MDBs and have other useful. Also, in the terms of the reform of MDBs, we had addressed the necessity to increase the diversity or the balance of geographically and gender representation on the board of the international finance architectures. And I think the new areas, so something really new that we have done, was the way that we lead with Africa, because we have the African Union new incorporation. So we decided to have Africa-led debates, so give them voice to talk about their interests, their necessities, not patronize them. That's something important we have done. As a finance track, we organized an Africa-led debate on debt and on infrastructure. It's a different when we talk about the past with the Germany presidents and how they made something to discuss the Africa issues on infrastructure and other aspects. The second point was the G20 social, the civil society participation, and the women aspects on global economy as a cross-cutting issue that we organized also a side event with the Empowerment Women Working Group at the Sherpas track. 2 things that for me it was a challenge and we did not achieve to make a good progress was the reform of global governance in terms of the realignment of the quotas and the new, participation of underdeveloped countries. We can talk about why it's not because we don't want to present something like that. It's something about the difficulties inside G20 finance track and the debt issues. And I think South Africa will face this issue about debt next year as a big, important theme. So I think to start, sorry.
Thank you, Tatiana, and also for calling attention to one aspect which we haven't heard very much related to representation, right? I think both the UN Pact for the Future and and the call for action of the G20 talks about the need not only to increase representation in terms of geographic balance, as you said, but also gender representation. We know that even when developing nations manage to get a seat on the table, they're often represented by men. And it's very important now that both UN member states and G20 countries have committed to change that reality, and us as civil society should watch this space and demand change on that front as well. So I'll finally turn to you, Marcos, Vinicius. We have heard a lot about the governance perspective and the engagement group perspective, but it will also be interesting to hear from you a little bit on how the bank has engaged with this G20 presidency of Brazil, especially on the topic that keeps coming up related to the reform of the international financial architecture.
Thank you very much for Plataforma CIPÓ and IPEA for the work on the T20 and also for the invite. I was one day a researcher at IPEA, so I will always accept an invitation from IPEA. I was just saying that I was one day a researcher of IPEA, and I will always accept an invitation when it comes from IPEA, and also Plataforma CIPÓ. This is a great research institute, if not the most relevant institute, research institute, one of the most. Is it better now? Or maybe I was too far from the microphone. Yes. Okay, so all the good things I said about IPEA and Plataforma CIPÓ was not on the records. No, so just to talk about a little bit how the bank has partnered with the G20. Not only because the G20 have a big piece of voting power in the bank governance, the bank has engaged quite well with the G20, but also because the agendas that the Brazilian presidency is putting forward under the G20 is quite well aligned with the priorities the bank is working in the last 1.5 years or 2 years, no? Under the evolution agenda, no? Which has a lot to do with doing more financing for climate, improving the capacity and effectiveness of the bank to tackle poverty, inequality. So there is a big alignment on the agenda that Brazil is putting forward, and also how the bank is trying to be better and bigger. So I think this has helped a lot on the engagement of the bank. Of course, the bank has participates in all the working groups, has a seat on all the sessions, like all other MDBs. But I will highlight just two things that I think are very critical on how the bank is partnering with Brazil. One, under the Global Alliance Against Hunger. At this time, we are in the middle of a replenishment of IDA, as you know, and the civil society is a great partner, mobilizing donors to get a big replenishment, a robust replenishment. And under the discussions of the Global Alliance, the bank has committed a few things to gather this momentum. So if Brazil is championing this topic of food security, of fighting extreme poverty, of course, it has been a great political momentum for the bank to align its priorities. So if you go to the policy documents of IDA, you'll see food security there as a strategic piece. But also President Ajay Banga has announced that IDA will be available to finance policies that are identified under the basket of policies of the Global Alliance. And he has also announced a target of supporting 500 million people until 2030 with social protection policies that includes food security. So I think Brazil has built that, and the bank has so far delivered these commitments that are, I believe, is a real win-win situation for both agendas. And another issue I would raise is not exactly a deliverable of the G20, but has been generated under the G20, which is the what is being called the TFFF, which is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which is an innovative instrument that we hope to launch under COP, but it was in the sidelines of the G20 that we have been building the design of this facility and also getting country support. Very simple explanation of what is this facility is basically to create a facility that would pay for countries that are being successful in keeping the forest standing. Because today there are resources on how to stop deforestation, but once you stop deforestation, you don't get any financial support. And there are communities that are living in the forest, and it's important that communities keep getting income if they are successfully keeping forests standing. So it's a facility that will try to address this gap, to put it this way. And it's innovative because it doesn't rely on donations from ODA only. It has a component of ODA, but it's mostly on private contributions. So private sector can come to the facility. The facility will have, let's say, an asset management strategy to remunerate these investors, and the net income out of this facility would be the source of financing for countries that are protecting the forest. I think I would highlight these two, not to as you say, not to list many topics that the bank has participated. I think these two are very symbolic on the for Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you. Great mention of the facility, and very good to know that the World Bank is working with Brazil on this. As we know, keeping the forest standing costs, and those countries need capacity and resources to do that. So I'll go back to our initial speaker, Fabio, who wears many hats. So he spoke about the T20, but now he's going to talk about the Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, because you know you have a very direct involvement with it. Can you tell us about it?
Okay, thank you, Mayara. It was good that Marco used some of his time to introduce the topic, so I can, again, be very brief on it. The Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty had its foundational documents approved by the G20 in 24th July this year in a meeting in Rio. But the important thing to keep in mind is that this alliance is not a G20 alliance, and it's not an alliance for the G20. So it was thought and embedded, it was discussed and approved within the G20 as a way to galvanize support and address some of the challenges that had been pointed out by 5 background papers that the task force has commissioned to several organizations and think tanks. The alliance has 3 pillars. One is the national one, in which national governments, countries adhere to the alliance, and they state what they will do for combating hunger and poverty in its own context. It means that the alliance is not only for poor countries or countries with high rates of poverty. It's also for developed countries that face, and we saw that in COVID-19, face huge issues of food security and nutrition, and also poverty, particularly child poverty. The second thing is that the countries also state in that national commitment how they are going or how they are willing to support other countries. And that can be either financially or with knowledge sharing with other countries. So we can also have South-South cooperation, for example, as a key component of the alliance. And that's something that Brazil actually stimulates a lot. After that, we have the financial pillars, in which we have the multilateral development banks, international financial institutes, but also bilateral financial support from countries that commit in the national pillar to offer this type of support. And finally, the third pillar that focuses on the knowledge that can be shared. Then we can have countries, we can have some knowledge institutions like the World Bank as well. So the president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, has promised that in the meeting in July in Rio, that the knowledge that the bank generates around social protection, food security, and nutrition would be available for the alliance. Having said that, and trying to make a link with the focus of the discussion today, that's the climate finance. One of the findings of one of the background papers that was commissioned to ODI was actually the difficulty in having access to some of the funds that exist and are not easily available to the countries to implement policies that can fight hunger and poverty. And as Marcus said, the Alliance is curating a policy basket with evidence at the national level of several countries that can be used to fight hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. So it's based on evidence, it's like data-driven, but how can countries have access to resources to implement this policy, how they can find the fiscal space that Adriana was talking about. So that's the big question that the ODI paper was trying to address. And they were pinpointing the fact that resources have been dispersed around too many different funds, and it's really hard for the least developed countries to have the capacity to learn and to comply with all the requirements to address this. A similar diagnostic was actually made for the green funds as well, right? So the connection here is pretty clear. So this, the multiplicity of fundings and the different requirements for countries to have access to them, it's really a challenge. So one of the things that the Alliance wants to put emphasis on is actually to support the matchmaking around the means of implementation, knowledge and funding, and the demands of the countries, how we can bring it together. So just to highlight, for example, that it's not only funds directly to poverty, like IDA, like the ones in the IMF, the Poverty Trust, but also we should look at the climate funds, because adaptation, building resilience, that has everything to do with sustainable agricultural practice, with supporting smallholder farmers, with increasing social protection coverage that we saw. ILO has just launched its latest report showing the lack of coverage of social protection in the low-income countries. Less than 10% of the population is covered by at least one social protection instrument. It's not much. It's very low. So that's the ambition of the Alliance, is to do this matchmaking between requests, demand-driven from the countries, and the means of implementation on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabio. Very important point about the need to also engage the climate funds. I think this alliance, it's a very concrete example of how you can make the social and environmental and economic pillars of sustainable development walk together. As you know, there are some repercussions for sustainable agriculture, potential for climate adaptation as well. So very good to know that you're trying to engage the climate funds as well. I will go back to Adriana. You already touched a little bit upon the barriers to access finance, but if you could talk a bit more about that, but also in terms of what are these reforms, these transformational reforms that are needed in order for us not only to scale up climate finance and sustainable development finance, but to do so in a way that also tackle inequalities, but also deals with fiscal constraints and the debt burden which affects so many developing countries today.
Thank you. Well, that's a big question. I briefly mentioned, I think, two of the main structural barriers, right? The lack of adequate representation of developing countries in the key institutions of global governance, including the international financial system, is not just an issue of justice, it's also an issue of effectiveness, because we see that recommendations and policy sometimes are pushed based more on the understandings and the interests of donor states than developing countries. The other one I mentioned was the trade system, which is, I don't know if fragmented is exactly the right word, or if, formation of blocks is a better description of what's happening. But the major losers tend to be developing countries, especially least developed and smaller economies. So again, coming back to multilateralism and coming up with constructive solutions is absolutely necessary there. But I wanted to highlight two or three structural barriers, as you put it. The first one is the global debt crisis. And I'm using this phrase very openly, because if we have 3.3 billion people around the planet who live in countries that have to spend more on debt servicing than on education and health, why is this not considered a global crisis? 80 countries currently are either at risk or in grave debt default risk. Why is this not a global crisis? And within the G20, our finance track led several initiatives to try to help to address. It's a very complex problem. Politically, it's very difficult for many different reasons. But for instance, the finance track organized a debate on this issue that was led by African countries, which may seem like something very basic, but once you study the debt crisis, you find out that it's not, because these countries typically have very little voice. Borrower countries have very little voice, and solutions, if they are solutions, are proposed by either the Paris Club or don't include other creditors, especially private creditors, that when they do enter negotiations, they do it very separately in a sort of divide and conquer manner. Associated with the debt. So the debt crisis shows us that we do not have the adequate mechanisms, both to solve the problem and to prevent it from happening altogether, because the developing world has seen recurring crises of debt. And in our region, we know this very well. We experienced it during my lifetime. The cost of capital for developing countries is disproportionately high. This is true even for a country like Brazil, an emerging economy with relative capacity to mobilize domestic resources, but it's especially true of the countries that need capital the most, including climate vulnerable countries. And we have to better understand this distortion. And some of them we did discuss, including in the Climate Task Force. So I wanted to point out, for instance, that there are policies, norms, and standards that were implemented in the aftermath of the 2007 and 2008 crisis that have had unintended consequences, especially in the sense of A, increasing even further the cost of capital for developing countries, and B, discriminating against non-OECD countries. So frameworks like Basel III, banking regulations, Solvency II for insurance companies in Europe, but this has a cascading effect across the world. Some accounting practices that were put in place around then. And the role of credit agencies insofar as, for instance, they have not adequately incorporated the climate crisis into stress tests. And therefore, the perception of risk and the evaluation of risk needs to be updated, right? So I'm just mentioning here a few examples. There are others where I think there is some headway being made here in Washington. The interest rates of the IMF and the surcharges that are topped up, right, on top of all of that. All of these are structural measures, and therefore there are policies that can be made or unmade in order to at least help to redress these factors and help open up fiscal space. And there's a paradigm shift needed as well. The types of conditionalities that are imposed. When austerity is imposed from the outside, it leads to great social hurt. And it leads, as we have seen in recent cases, to social unrest. So we need to normalize discussion of fiscal policy and for the measures necessary for that. And then finally, I just wanted to mention one last structural factor. War prevents us from having well-being, dignity, just transition, development. And we are living in an extremely complicated environment. So mediation, conflict resolution, and prevention of conflict should also be considered as part of our efforts to finance the just transition. Because in many parts of the world, it really is becoming the biggest barrier to achieving that end. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. We also reinforce this point that you did around trade, because initially there was quite a lot of enthusiasm, including from civil society, on ideas like CBAM, the EU carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And as time has passed, we've got some interesting papers, including by UNCTAD, that shows that the potential to reduce emission of those schemes are minimum. But on the other hand, the potential of reducing the income of developing countries, it's exponential. So I think it is very important for us to be thinking of how the G20 can think of shifting a bit this narrative from a punitive logic to one that focus more on positive incentives and how to support countries to build the capacity to implement their own plans to build up a sustainable supply chains, etc. So thanks for bringing this issue around trade and war as well. We should be talking a bit more about peace. Moving on to you, Luis, you already spoke a little bit about resetting action, but if you could talk about the second priority of the task force, which is resetting finance and how to align financial flows with the goals of the Paris agreements, but also because this year we have what everyone is calling the finance COP, the negotiations around the new collective quantified goal in climate finance, to what extent the discussions that are taking place in the G20 can contribute towards a more successful outcome of COP in Baku this year.
Thank you. This is a very good question, and I think that it has a simple answer. Because the choice of the presidency was not to get involved, if I may say so, in that discussion, because we want to preserve the space of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement to respond to discussions on the NCQG, so the new quantitative collective goal. But we did promote very intense discussions on finance, because we do understand that ambition in action goes hand in hand with ambition in finance. And it's very clear now, and the Indian presidency of the G20 made a very good progress in terms of identifying what the investment gaps, if you can call it a gap. I think that's also a discussion that Adriana and in a way Flavio also mentioned, which is the money is there. So can we really talk about the gap? So what really should be talking about is how we can divert the money towards sustainable practice. So how we can, in a way, also transition away from unsustainable investments. And the way we organized those discussions under TF Klima was talking mainly about three main elements, which we call as more systemic or structural discussions. We're not talking about green financial instruments, sustainable finance, we're not talking about green bonds. Those are all very important. There has been great progress. But what we really should be talking about is the issue of debt in many developing countries, even those issues about the unintended consequences of Basel III and Solvency II, we gave the opportunity to discuss too. But the way we will conclude discussions on this particular topic is organized around three main buckets. So the first one is the role of regulatory frameworks, in particular the role of central banks. It's coming more and more, even in COP decisions, that we need this whole of government, whole of society approach, and that also obviously includes central banks that have and will continue to contribute to addressing climate change within their mandates. We also discussed, and we'll have conclusions on the issue of cost of capital for developing countries that Adriana referred to, in particular mechanisms to mitigate the impact of foreign exchange in the capacity of developing countries to access finance. And also very much building on the work of the finance track. We have Tatiana here, but we also have Lucas and Vinicius that I see, and they have been instrumental in delivering the outcome of TF Klima. And we will have messages also on the role of MDBs in addressing climate change and the vertical climate funds like the Green Climate Fund and JEF and the Adaptation Fund. And that all will translate into a package that will be, with crossing all my fingers here, announced on Thursday, which will comprise a ministerial statement of the four ministries, if you can call the central bank a ministry, but just for the sake of the argument. So climate and environment, foreign affairs, finance, and central bank governance delivering a joint message through a very bold ministerial statement with extremely new messages and some unprecedented ones. So keep an eye on it. I cannot spoil it, but please keep an eye on it on Thursday. And we'll also announce this outcome document that contains messages on those principles that I referred to in my previous intervention on national transition planning and country platforms, and also some recommendations on the alignment of finance, in particular private finance, with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, but I also have to take this opportunity to mention something else, and that goes to what Tatiana referred to, the challenges. And you all know, and we all know, how difficult those climate discussions are, and that there is a limit to what we can achieve through the multilateral process. And that was one of the reasons why we decided to commission to 12 experts a report that would respond to the same issues that we presented to countries. So we presented the issues to the G20 countries and invited guests, but we also presented those same issues to a group of 12 experts, and we asked them to come up with a report. And this group has been co-chaired by Professor Mariana Mazzucato from the University College of London and from Dr. Vera Songve, which has done a lot. Currently, she chairs a facility that deals with debt issues, including in Africa. But she's a super expert in the issue of climate finance and this relationship with the macroeconomy. And they both chaired this group composed of 12 experts that will release their report tomorrow. In fact, it will be at 8:30 in the morning. For the early birds, you may wish to go to room MC 13400, so the other building. And they will be releasing their report, which is an independent report. So it's not part of the multilateral process of the G20, but they will be delivering what they see, this group sees, this group of 12 people sees as recommendations for aligning both industrial policy and finance with the objective of 1.5. So also staying tuned for that. And we are very much looking forward to our ministerial meeting on Thursday. And it really is something that has exceeded our expectations, with all the challenges, with all the difficulties, but it really has exceeded our expectations in terms of the innovation that we put in front of countries. So we ask them to think outside the box, to work differently, and we have got feedback from pretty much all the G20 countries that has been an incredible, useful exercise for them internally as well. So I can certainly say that it was a great exercise for us in Brazil to gather the 4 ministries and think about a common agenda. But we got the feedback that, beyond the outcomes that we will have achieved, that we will announce on Thursday, that the exercise in itself was very useful to get, on one side, the finance side of the house, central banks and ministries of finance, to understand the urgency, to understand that we are on the brink of something very, very serious, and that we have to address with urgency climate change. And to the other side of the house, so the more like climate negotiators and technical ministries like ministries of environment and climate, they understand the opportunities and the limitations to what we can do in finance, and what is the agenda that we still have in front of us. So it will certainly not be the conclusion of or the solutions to the climate crisis, but will certainly give countries, both domestically, this new perspective, we hope, but also some very important messages that ministers will deliver on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, and congratulations for the work. I think it's important to remember that we came from a situation last year that the G20 wasn't able to achieve ministerial declarations because of the whole geopolitical constraints. And this year we not only have ministerial declaration, but we have a joint ministerial declaration with finance ministers, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and governors of central banks. So we look forward to reading that on Thursday. Marcos. Oh no, sorry, Tatiana, not you yet. So, your favorite topic, Tatiana. You are the G20 social coordinator within the Ministry of Finance. Tell us a little bit more. how do you see this process? What were the challenges, the achievements? And of course, we have a G20 Social Summit coming up in November in Rio, ahead of the Head of State Summit. So, please.
So, yeah, Social G20 was an innovation of Brazilian presidents. Lula's president decided that it would be prioritized. The idea is that, as I understood, it's not just about democracy and legitimacy, but it's to make the real sense by who is the motor of global economy, and is the people really affected by the poly-crisis scenarios needs to be a role in this forum. Needs to be listened, needs to be, part of the decisions of the negotiations. So that's the sense of enhance the social participation. And the challenge is that it usually happen with something parallel with the engagement groups and the Sherpa track interaction. So the Minister of Finance decided to have a dedicated team to make it happen into the finance track, or within the finance track. It was a challenge because the finance track, as I told, is a closed forum with chairs and co-chairs, and the teams could be less accessible or less public. So the first topic is, I think, as transparency, as engagement of civil society to make it be translated and accessible. So to have access to the issues note is the first thing we need to do, Then, so it was a lessons learned and something that it was learning by doing. We didn't have the recipe when we started, and we were just reaching out the way that we could do it. In terms of, you have a multilateralism, UN has something with the multiple stakeholders, but in this forum, how we could do it. I think the first objective was to coordinate dialogues between the engagement groups, because they usually work separated. So how we could bring synergy with them and show that they can work together. So that was one of our achievements. The president office coordinate many meetings with them, and we find a way. They asked us to have a chair, to have a seat in the ministerial meetings or in the deputies meetings, and it was politically and logistically impossible to guarantee it in the beginning. Then we found a way. Let's have them a special session inside the deputies meeting. I could say it was not a claim that they give us. It was something that we found out that, it can be a solution that as we cannot deliver what they wanted because we are presidents, we have something as a constrangement, So I think it was one of the good achievements. And why that? Because it was done in July at the third ministerial or deputies meeting. So we still have time to be incorporated at the final declaration. The time here is important when you're talking not just about participation, but influence, because that's something, We can have participation, we can listen to the people, but they cannot be really, incorporate their inputs and their demands. The second objective was to expand the social base, because you have this kind of stakeholders that are always here at the IMF meetings or at the UN meetings, they have fundings, but you don't have grassroots movements or even some expertise networks that can help or can give real inputs. I think in the terms of the finance track, we did both. Grassroots movements and at the same time expertise, like for taxation. What's very important to listen then, that they said us, we don't want to have just G20 as a forum for taxation agenda. And then the end that we had reached out the ministerial declaration, we came to UN to start the protocol at the UN convention. So it was good. At the beginning, we didn't know that UN will have this role into the taxation agenda. So it's good, when you can listen, and we also involved other stakeholders in that thing. And I think that the last thing is to have this social summit just 3 days before the leader summit, when, of course, it will be a very great moment to have all these people, also grassroots movements, engagement groups, and other actors being in Rio de Janeiro to a big event. It's expected 2,000 people in the streets of Rio de Janeiro. The presidents have received more than 1,000 self-organized activities. And at the beginning, they just have 120 slots. They're trying to find more spaces in order to guarantee more voices. And I think the idea is that global civil society show us that you really need a space for debates, for meetings, and for exchange experiences and talk about the challenges and the proposals that you can address to the states and the governments. So we really think that at the moment we are working to have a declaration from this social summit to be delivered for the President Lula. And also the engagement groups is preparing a letter for Ramaphosa president in order to ask to continue the social G20 experience in terms of the access to the documents, to the session, and so on. And just to finalize, I'm sorry if I was a little bit longer, but it was good to see in South Africa how the foreign minister is committed to continue with G20 Social. And the civil society is really, really energical in doing something. I think it will really be stronger than we did, because they are very combative and they are really motivated to address this big challenge as the debt taxation and the reform of global governance. So it was really good that one of our achievements or our goals was to have it as a legacy from Brazilian presidents. And I think this could be one sense of the reform of global governance, if you can strengthen the civil society participation. I'm sorry, I really was emotional with this.
No, thank you, and congratulations as well, because this is another area where in 1 year things changed dramatically. From those who were involved in the Indian G20 presidency, the space for civil society was very, very restricted, in particular for some other engagement groups like the C20. So changing that to Brazil and having the Sherpas and the deputies sitting down with the C20, the W20, B20, etc., was a major improvement, and I'm glad to know that South Africa will continue and potentially improve some of this work, and hopefully the US after as well, and we carry on, make it this space better. Our final speaker will be Marco Vinicius Stiliato. Again, you already mentioned a bit on the work that the bank has been doing with the G20 presidency, but if you could expand a bit more specifically on the issue of climate sustainable development finance, what are the efforts towards more affordable and accessible financial flows for developing countries, especially those that, as Adriana mentioned in her intervention, are struggling to repay the debts. Thank you.
No, thank you. Of course, the most effective way to increase financing from development bank is through a capital increase, because every additional dollar in equity, the bank can leverage more than 5 times. So this is, of course, the most effective way to increase financing. We haven't had a capital increase since 2018, but what the bank has been done, especially in the evolution that I've mentioned before in the last 1 year and a half or 2 years, is to expand lending capacity with the given capital we have. So that means expanding leverage. And just last week we approved bringing even further down the equity to loan ratio, which is exactly the ratio into which how much loans you make for every dollar. And the bank has also created new instruments, and I can mention what is called the hybrid capital, which were voluntary contributions from shareholders from Global North. And it's a hybrid capital because it's a bond, it's a debt with a maturity that is perpetual. So in the books of the bank, it's considered as equity. So it's on the same time a bond and equity. That's why they call hybrid capital. And there is no voting power attached to. So Global North, they brought some hybrid capital. They are bringing, it takes time to come into the books of the bank. But once in the books of the bank can again leverage this resource. So with these initiatives, the bank will be expanding financing on around $150 billion. It's not enough, as I said. The most effective is always a capital increase, given the needs for climate and the global challenges, as the bank is calling. But this is what the bank has been doing. And I think the biggest, and this is, of course, IBRD, middle-income countries. And then for low-income countries, the instrument is IDA, and now we are hoping to get to a robust replenishment so the bank can expand its capacity for financing low income. And one critical, or on the negative side, of the expanding financing. So I think it's good that the bank managed to expand the financing through these instruments I mentioned. But one thing that is lacking is that the additional financing needs also to be subsidized, needs to be concessional also for middle-income countries, and this is part of the evolution. But this depends on the Global North country also making contributions to what the bank calls the Livable Planet Fund, and it's with that fund that the bank will be able to provide to middle-income countries concessional financing. And the logic of this is because everyone benefits when you tackle global challenges. This is the main idea. It's not enough if one country reduces emission and others are increasing. So it's in Global North, Global South interest that you provide financing for middle-income countries to reduce emissions or to work with public health systems and pandemic preparedness. It doesn't help if Europe has an amazing system of health protection, but otherwise doesn't. The pandemics don't respect borders. So the idea is that concessional financing for middle-income countries is also critical, and of course we rely on contributions from Global North. This would be my bit of criticism in the process, and we hope to improve in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We only got 5 minutes for questions, but I would like to give the opportunity to see if anyone in the audience would like to raise questions for our panelists. I see a hand, 2, 3 hands.
It's fine. I think my voice is okay. My name is Adu. I'm representing Alpha Zulu Advocates from UK, but I also wear different hats like you. So I'm based in Addis. I came from Ethiopia, and I had a chance to meet recently. The president was also in Ethiopia. So I want to really stress on the Minister Luis says, I wish if you talk more about resettling of action, because what I've been talking is we also really doing it in my country with a different level, but we're from the CSO, so this physical space is really a challenge. I've been to the UN, I was also at the summit of the Future Action Day, so the talking is there, but when it comes to the action, there is a big gap. So I don't want to take more of the question due to time, but I wish if you talk, she brings you to the topic of resettling finance, but I want to hear more of the action. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Neil. I work at CAFOD, which is the Caritas UK. It was more a thank you and a hoping that this will help. It's the Jubilee year next year for the Catholic Church, so people remember Jubilee 2000. So for the Catholics, it's the Jubilee year 2025. So we're hoping all of the fantastic work that Brazil did for its G20 will carry on and will achieve that. As you said, the debt crisis and everything else, but also tax, all fits in with those Jubilee principles of resetting, renewal and cancellation. So thank you.
Yes, I'm Juliet Adams with Hamilton National Dance Day, also a candidate for the Civil Society Policy Forum Working Group. And how do I put this? Individuals want action. They want action. This is a country of great power, if we know to use our power. We are in Washington. Washington is a powerful place. And it seems as the World Bank has a president who is willing to follow action, because he can't do it alone. What is the action plan? Because all I'm hearing is the need. What has happened? There's a shift. There's a power shift where those at the top cannot deliver anymore, even if they did. You have to empower civil society. Civil society is the key, which persons may be afraid of. So you tell us, as civil society, what we need to do to translate it in a non-fearful way to those at the top. You have people who spend thousands of dollars to come here. So talk to us, real talk. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ivana from the Center for Economic and Policy Research here in DC. I heard the panelists mention SDR rechanneling as one of the agenda items, and I'm wondering if a new allocation of SDRs will also be on the agenda as a way to provide, immediate liquidity, debt-free to the Global South while these other structural issues are being worked out. Thank you.
Go back to the panelists. If you could each have like 2 minutes so that we don't go advance in time very much. But let's change a little bit, because Marcos, you've been the... Oh, so, well, my friend, it's you again. So if you want to address any of the...
Okay, action. Well, I'm going to talk about the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, because that's basically about action. But I don't need to mention it here, and I think that Tatiana already touched upon it. The difficult to get consensus within the G20 countries. I mean, they have different openness to the participation of civil society in the process. But I would highlight that in the foundation documents of the Alliance, it has been recommended that the process of implementation of the programs and policy instruments in the basket that are going to be supported by the Alliance go through consultations with civil society, engage civil society in the implementation. Of course, that's a country level decision in the implementation, because everything is going to be country driven. But from the Brazilian experience and many of the policies that have been successfully implemented in Brazil, they were born at the subnational level and with great involvement of civil society. And that has been through pressure from civil society that they have been incorporated and mainstreamed into policy. And of course, the civil society has a major role in doing the oversight and sometimes actually supporting the implementation of these programs and policies that have been successful in reducing food insecurity and combating poverty.
Adriana, please.
Thank you for the comments. I appreciate your point about civil society. I come from civil society. I was there before I came to government. I agree that it's essential. But I think we need to think about the ecology of actors that are necessary to drive change. And within the G20, our Ministry of Innovation and Administration organized a side event called the State of the Future, which was really, really refreshing, because what was debated was how can we have a state that delivers for people in concrete ways, that is effective, that is updated to the challenges that we face now, including the digital transformation and the backsliding in the SDG achievements, and that is innovative. And how does it work? Well, with civil society, which oxygenates, right, our search for answers, but also with private sector. Because we know that even though, and I've been stressing here fiscal policies and fiscal space and the role of public finance, but we will need much more. And it's a massive challenge. How do you get a private sector that is structured around the short-term logic of profits to help us finance what are long-term propositions like adaptation and structural transformation of the economy? And I think there are no easy answers, but I think the presidency of the G20 during Brazil's term has tried to work on different aspects of this equation so that we can deliver more ideas about working together so to have concrete results. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah, just trying to build on what Adriana just said. I think we live a situation nowadays where we all, as civil society, as individuals, we want from the government what is usually associated to companies, and we want from companies what is usually associated to governments, right? So we want governments to deliver at speed, to be quick, to respond to society needs, and we want from businesses to be more transparent, to have a social dimension included in the way they work. So we clearly live in an area where everything's changing, that companies will have to change, that governments will have to change. In essence, now I'll try to make a very difficult link here with the Reset in Action. What we try to do is basically to follow a recommendation of the IPCC, which says that we have to move beyond this project-based approach where we put a lot of different organizations competing for very scarce resources. So what if we change the logic? What if we as a society, as the whole government, not only the Ministry of Environment or different ministries that, by the way, compete amongst themselves as well, how about if we put those different government departments together and in dialogue with civil society to make sure that we cater for their needs, to make sure that we talk about reskilling, about new job opportunities? How about if we do that and we build a platform that will be out there for different sources of finance to put in money. So that is the essence what we are trying to deliver, a very short set of principles that try to respond to this very difficult question. But in essence, we are in the middle of the change. So maybe that's why we can't see what all the solutions are, but we are certainly going towards something different that we hope will be more inclusive of civil society, and that's very much in the interest of the Brazilian government. Thank you.
So thank you for the comments. For Jubilee, Brazil is also engaged. The Minister of Finance has been there this year, and we are looking to participate on next year. And I think it's important to say that in the 2025, I think 60 billion of debt will become due, so it will really be a crisis. If it's not yet, next year it will be. To talk about the civil society as the key or as a pillar, I agree with you. It's the necessity, and it's really a challenge. We also think, and it was something that drove our work on that, is that when you are talking about G20 challenges, because it's a consensus forum, like a veto one, the support of civil society in some of priorities when we are talking about combating inequality or other aspects, it's very important for the governments, for the presidency, you know. So it's necessary when you're talking about defeat some powers blocks that works inside G20. So I think that's the mean. We can have a parallel block, or you can just decide how to defeat the powers participating into some institution like G20. It's a choice, I think. It's a decision. About SDR channeling, no, it was not immediate liquidity. It was, I know that civil society has a claim about the use of the 605 billion as the COVID time to be really used for the climate change or other challenges. What we have approved is that for each $4, use it, because we are talking about the reserve or liquidity, and SDR are a reserve for the countries. That's why it's not easy to approve the liquidity on that, the use of this resource. And the idea is that for each $4 spent, one of them can be channeled, reallocated as a research for MDB. So for some of the multilateral development bank that can be a resource used to other projects or other use. So you need to make some counts and then see how it can be used. But it's a progress in terms of SDR, but I think it still can be more strong than what we have done.
Would you like to react? Yeah.
No, I think I can comment a little bit on the call to action. I'm not sure if it was exactly to us. I mean, I think as a shareholder, I think Brazil is really convinced that Ajay Banga is doing a big effort on making the bank more effective, more efficient, bigger. The bank is a huge institution with a long-standing tradition, long-standing culture. Some countries still perceive the bank as arrogant, as patronizing, the word you use, no? Mm-hmm. It is still true, but we generally are convinced that Ajay Banga is trying to drive change in the institution, and we are convinced that he is delivering results, no? So I think we have to support the way he's driving change through the bank, not only on financial numbers, but also how the bank engages with country, supporting country platforms, as we've been discussing, supporting programs that are country-led, and also on the knowledge side, that the knowledge products are not the typical economists sitting here in Washington, D.C., but the knowledge products that are developed through institutions such as IPEA or other institutions from the Global South, where the knowledge generation of the bank comes attached to the needs of countries and also using knowledge that are coming from countries. And Ajay has understood this in our view, and he's trying to move the World Bank Group towards this direction, both on operations and on knowledge. Thank you. I don't speak on behalf of him, by the way. I don't speak on behalf of the bank, but as Brazil, as a shareholder, this is how we see it.
Thank you, Marcos. Well, thank you, all the panelists, for being here. Again, I know this week is particularly busy for you all. I was in an event recently in Rio, and Gustavo, also from the presidency, said we see more each other than we see our families. So we're probably quite glad that the G20 Brazil is almost over this year. But next year we have COP30 in Belém. We have the BRICS summit. So you'll be hearing a lot more from the Brazilian government, from the Brazilian civil society. And thank you for staying with us. The recording of this meeting will be online on the Civil Society Policy Forum website. And once again, have a good evening, and thank you for joining us.